Paul, keep talking to me about this. So this is a situation that you just seen this, and now you want to you're going more in on this, or help me understand how this has affected your opinion of this volunteer work and what you're doing. Yeah.
Well, initially I was on panels reviewing younger kids and
Uh-huh.
whether they should be returned back to the biological mom or dad or both.
Uh-huh.
And more recently, on the panels, there's been, a couple of older teenagers, and I can just see where it's urgent to get involved. Not that it's not urgent with the younger kids, but really something needs to get done within the next couple of months, or they're going to take a wrong turn, or they're going to fall, or something is going to happen that's not going to result in a happy life.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, it's brought on more urgency
How
to
did
get.
you get involved in this, Paul? What inspired you to take your valuable time and work for free in something?
I've always kind of believed in signs. Things just happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're aware of different signs, they'll point you in a direction.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife said to me, Paul, why don't you do some volunteer work? And a buddy of mine said the same thing, like
Mm-hmm.
within the same week.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sat down at my desk, I typed in volunteer work, and here comes this DCF, state of Massachusetts, looking for volunteers. And I clicked it and I read it and uh, saw some value in it. And I thought I'd be pretty good at it, and applied and interviewed and reference checked and all this stuff. And boom, I was in there. They're very thorough, and doing a lot of lessons with them and tutorials, and probably for about a week. And then I started, joining into panels representing the community, and, getting involved in developing action plans, and, asking questions and evaluating biological parents and whether the children should be returned, and dealing with attorneys and that kind of thing.
So,
So,
so this nonprofit must have been thrilled when they saw you send in a request to offer your time and your experiences, because they don't always get somebody with your background. Was that the case? Is it? And this is a well-funded nonprofit, or a little bit of background about the, not, you don't have to use their name, but they obviously resonated with you. There was something on their website that made you feel they were worthy of your time. Tell us a little bit about that process, and then it sounds to me like what you were doing is what you always do. You look at a situation. You talked about this in business, right? You look at the problem, and then you start to create a system or a plan to execute a solution to the problem. And it appears that's what's happening with this. Would that be a fair evaluation?
yeah, I think I knew that I'd be coming from a different standpoint. I thought that, I looked at the profiles of a lot of people running it and involved in it. And I knew that, I was coming from a different vantage point, and I could bring in some new ideas, new experiences, uh, that were not being represented at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because my experience with working with a number of nonprofits, but also my own, was we, we or the people running those are almost too close to the problem, right? So somebody like yourself can come from the outside, see a fresh perspective, and then immediately maybe identify the problems. Of course, at that point, part of it's being naive, or naivety of not realizing how complicated these problems get. And it
Sure.
sounds, yeah, yes. So did yeah, kind of explain how long you've been doing this and why do you do it? What makes you feel, what was the calling or at this stage in your life where you feel that this was a worthy cause?
Well, I'm married and I've got a 15-year-old and a 27-year-old, and I'm very involved in their lives. But I've pretty much retired from work
Hmm.
and had a lot of time on my hands and wanted to kind of do something worthwhile and to occupy my time. My golf game was not improving at all, as I'm sure Mark could attest to. And, it was something that I felt that, I could have some impact with. And what happened was it led me from doing volunteer with this one organization over to, other organizations that support, uh, you know, foster kids,
Mhm.
and go an extra step in getting involved in, whether it be sports or housing or mentorship or preparing these young teenagers on how to build a career or look at a career or interview for a job, you know, that really took effect with me and generated a lot of interest. And I thought I had a lot of background in that particular area.
Yeah. Well, first of all, congratulations for for being in a place in life where you have financial independence to decide what you want to do with your time. I think that's what everybody strives to have, and it's just great to see you're doing something with that.
Well, I'm quite a bit older than you and Mark.
It's still it's still financial independence is still financial independence, right? Whether it's I don't look at Mark and I can both relate, but we choose to do this weekly podcast because we can, one, we can afford to do it, and it's certainly not for all the money we're making, right, Mark? So it costs us money, it doesn't cost money, but yeah. So I think that also something that we spoke of before, how important for that at the particularly at that age, that they have some engagement, some community, some belonging. And I know that you use I use rugby, youth football, high school particularly, because if a kid is engaged in a sport, it could be anything, it doesn't have to be a sport. They're well, the graduation rate, at least where my old high school, at one point was it's sad to say it, it's the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the kids that go in graduate, 20% don't every single year. So ninth grade to eighth grade, 20% will not graduate from high school. But that goes up dramatically if they're engaged in an activity, some kind of a sport, particularly. So that, and it sounds like that's what you started doing as well, right? Paul, tell us a little bit about that, because I think you mentioned squash. Was that the sport that you were?
Yeah, my younger son Benjamin is very involved in squash, and I've gone to all the squash meets and started meeting different people. And there's an organization involved in bringing kids in and mentoring them academically and teaching them the game of squash and training them, and they have to achieve certain grades and not get in trouble and so on and so forth. And
Some
watching,
accountability. So did you bring that into the program, or were you already doing that and it was just a coincidence that you're
it was kind of another program that I kind of shifted over to and incorporated as well.
nice?
And started meeting some of the kids at some of
Mhm.
these squash tournaments, and you know, uh, watched how they behaved and how the camaraderie was very intense, and how they adapted to a kind of an elite sport and club with these private school kids, right?
Mhm.
And how they intermingled and interfaced and their mannerisms and how delightful they were. And they
Mhm.
really impressed me. So that got, that piqued my interest in, working with that group and getting to know them and then springboard into other organizations that were involved in, mentoring kids and that needed it. And hopefully, teaching them, some things where it would help them, throughout their life, and they could pick up some skills that they could transfer to other areas and bring along with them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
A couple of things come to mind about that, Paul. Yeah,
in my
please.
background, it was really, you know, it was a village that brought me up, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I grew up in a town south of Boston on the ocean, uh, that was small. And so, during storms, when we used to have big storms up here, that Mark could attest to, and living on the ocean, the community came very close to each other and supported each other. So anytime we heard about a nor'easter coming or a big snowstorm coming, I lived probably 50 yards from the North Atlantic, right? So Situate is always on the national news with these storms. And I grew up in an environment where it was very close knit community. Everyone was there for each other, and everyone was involved in everybody else's life. And it was a very close community. And the term "it takes a village" was really true back then,
Hmm.
during the 60s. And every parent knew you and you knew their family, and you didn't be misbehave in the neighborhood, or Mrs. So and so would get involved, or my mom would get involved, or so everyone was supporting each other, and everybody was lending a hand, and everybody was involved in helping out and looking out for each other.
Hmm.
And
And, and do
you
you feel that that's just going back to the squash, because I think it's kind of a beautiful story, right? First of all, that you realize that if these kids had some accountability, which is that any sport you have to be accountable, right? Mark, we talk about all the time, 90% of life is showing up. If you could just show up, and you show up on time, you show up prepared, and you show up all the time, you just made the 10% club. And but also you were able to make them feel like they I'm sure give them some confidence, give them some community. And most importantly, what my experience has been is exposure, that people do accept you as you are. And it's something I really appreciate that you haven't brought up. And I try not to mention it because it doesn't matter. And that is that obviously these kids are different, or have different, what I refer to as different hairstyles and different eye colors, right? And you haven't brought that up once, which is kind of cool, because I think a lot of times when people talk about underserved communities, they talk about what they look like. But you see it, and I don't want to speak for you, as that if you could give them maybe a childhood that you had or some of the benefits that you had, you can have an impact on this group of kids. Is that a fair evaluation of
Yeah,
why
I
you took
think
this
so.
approach?
And I think, during my work years,
Mhm.
over 45 years, I had different types of people working for me and coming in out of college with no experience, and coming from very different backgrounds
Mhm.
and privileges, and you know entering in a new world of work. And
Mhm.
so, you would look at everybody and get a little gauge on, what their background was and where they grew up and how they grew up, and then, really, get an idea of how to teach and mentor and manage those folks.
Mm. So as part of your business success was using these same uh, skills or techniques that to get the best out of people, out of their natural born talent. But I'd imagine that's holding them accountable, right? And also tracking the results. So yeah, that's really cool. I'm going to bring Mark into the conversation. Mark, you refer to Paul as your mentor. So I thought we'd start off by, uh, as we do often, reading the definition of the Google definition of mentorship, and then I'd really like to get your experience and how what you're hearing what Paul's doing now maybe relates to what it did to you when you were early on in your career.
Yeah, no. Well, what's interesting is the way that we began the conversation. I didn't really even know that we had begun, which is kind of cool. So, in the middle of this, I'll just remind everybody that this is the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. And episodically, we have a guest today, and who you've been listening to, Paul Carroll. Paul's an old friend, good friend, was a mentor of mine for many, many of my formative professional and personal years. And we just recently got back together communicating. Life had gotten in the way when we separated upon Paul selling one of his companies many, many years ago. And so he's been gracious enough to come back and join us here. And some of the stuff that Jim's been asking Paul about is directly related to my experience with him, and that is the mentorship piece. Um, Jim's been kind enough to share a definition. And so let me read that, and then let me jump back into my thought process here. So mentorship is a relationship between two people where the individual with more experience, knowledge, and connections is able to pass along what they've learned to a more junior individual within a certain field. The more senior individual is the mentor, and the more junior individual is the mentee. And yeah, when I talk about, Paul gifted me with a lot of experiences and skills. Talents perhaps that I had that he identified that he helped me turn into skills and experience that hopefully has evolved into wisdom. But yeah, and it's fascinating to me, Paul, that you've gotten back. It's like you didn't leave. It's like, yeah, maybe this is nonprofit. Yeah, maybe this is different. Maybe there's different cultural aspects to it, but the similarities abound um,
Yeah.
in what you're doing now as a complement to what you've been doing, which is founding and exiting seven, I believe, information technology related services organizations. So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks, Paul, by the way, for joining us on camera and all. And so jump back in, guys.
Yeah, Mark, I've got a couple of questions for you about. So, how old were you when you first met Paul?
I think I was 26. I was
26.
25, 26, I believe. Yeah.
So, just as Paul was saying, this is early on in your career. This is a few years out of college, and this is your first.
Yeah, I had been working. I've been working at one recruiting job, and among other people, with a young lady who Paul had subsequently hired. The people that worked in my organization prior to me meeting Paul, it was a boiler room factory that trained people how to do what we do, and Paul was in a position where he would be listening for the people that excelled in those organizations and got to about 3 or 4 years in, and there was a ceiling at those institutions, and he would take that experience for the right people and put them into his system, and everyone would kind of go to the next level with it. That's an
Yeah. That's
oversimplification,
so.
but
Let's
yeah.
stay with that just for a moment, Paul. And again, I'm gonna come back to you in a second, but we often we laugh about right being nice and being kind. So, does your mentor mean is your mentor now? You could reflect back on it. Was Paul a nice mentor or a kind mentor, and tell me about accountability because yeah, I'll let you finish answering the question before I say anything. But
He was neither. he he
this
was he was an excellent mentor, and I
well,
think that
tell me
no,
why.
I'm
Yeah.
all kidding aside. I think the very accountable systems guy, metrics, You know, things had to make sense. Simplicity was always a driver. Don't complicate things.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, there was a lot, so much wisdom in the approach. And some of it was kind of inside me from the way I was raised. And he
Mm-hmm.
just kind of helped me bring it out with confidence,
Mm-hmm.
which was born of knowledge and
Yeah.
information and lessons.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, there was nothing, certainly not, he didn't take the nice approach. He took the kind approach. And I think that that was appreciated. I mean, we had a couple of interesting run-ins as we developed our place with one another, but it was always in the same support of the same direction. Let's get
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
Let's
Now I'm
do
gonna
better. Let's
flip
be
back to
better.
Paul. So Paul, when you were building companies, or obviously talent uh, acquisition or finding talent is everything, right? Tell us a bit about that, what you saw in Mark, if you remember, and how that even applies to what you're doing now with mentorship in a nonprofit with some kids that you know really don't probably weren't like Mark at the time, right? They're just trying to get educated. They're early on in your phase. But yeah, I'd be interested in that, Paul. But just talent in general and your experience with Mark and going forward.
Sure. I actually remember the day very, very well. Even though my memory is going, my short-term memory is going, but my long-term memory,
That applies to all of us.
my hearing is going, but my smell and scent is getting stronger. So anyway, I saw Mark had a lot of potential, and that he just hadn't found the right channel yet. So Mark was very easy to understand and to work with, at least for me, because he was bright, he was articulate, it looked like he was ready to work, and he was very agile in terms of willing to change and needed to change and open to change. And so at the time, we were going through a kind of a mini computer meltdown here in the Boston area. And I had hooked up with somebody who set up a Florida office for me in Orlando. I think it was in the early 80s, 89, 90, something like that. Uh, and so I brought a lot of, not a lot, but a few uh, folks from Boston into Orlando to kind of open up that marketplace. And the market wasn't that sophisticated at the time, and Boston market was very competitive and very developed and very mature. So we were in kind of a catbird seat, being able to transfer that not the knowledge and the intellect and the skill of the people we had up here, and open up a Florida office to work in Orlando, Miami, and branched, I believe, into Atlanta, and eventually, I think, into North Carolina.
Mhm.
So it was a great opportunity for the company, and I think it was a great opportunity for the folks that
Mhm.
transferred down there.
Yeah.
But Mark struck me as somebody who could either fail quickly or do very well quickly. And fortunately, he did quite well. And I remember he put a mattress on the top of his car, and I gave him some money, and he got in his, I'm not sure what kind of car it was at the time, but I don't think it was a new Mercedes. And he got down there and went right to work and got an apartment right across the street, and focused and worked very hard and did quite well.
Yeah. So,
Uh,
so Paul, I want to get back to again just spotting talent, and I'm jumping back and forth from your mentorship to what you've done all your life, and obviously had a huge impact on many people, including Mark. But when you spot these kids, that you're working with today in some very different circumstances. Can you spot the talent the same way? I mean, do some of your past experiences, does it cross over from the volunteer work you're doing right now
I
to?
think so. I think it does. When I'm on, when I was hiring for my companies, over a period of 45 years, I could, spot or identify, work ethic and intellect pretty quickly.
Mm,
And, a little bit of family history and beliefs and, you know, cultural issues. And now today, when I see a teenager, I can just feel, there's something there.
interesting.
This
Yeah.
this this kid's pretty bright. He's had no direction, or she has had no direction. They've suffered a little trauma, but they can get over it, and they're fairly articulate. And
Mm.
all they need is direction, a little mentorship, a little hand to hold,
Yeah, and some accountability, right? As we all need.
and some
Yeah,
accountability too.
yeah,
I think kindness and mentorship and patience, which I've fortunately developed over many years, works pretty well. And
yeah.
and certainly, some activities, whether it be, the other day I was listening to an 18-year-old or 17-year-old with a lot of interest in getting into bioscience and interested in biology and wanting to potentially go to college, but didn't think they could. And, you know, uh, being able to quickly identify areas where this person could go and get help and, you know, get some information and progress and, fire up that interest and that initial seed and help it grow.
Mhm.
You know, fit well into what I did for so long
Yeah,
because I would usually hire people out of college with no experience or little experience and be able to show them a certain way of doing the work or doing the profession that perhaps they had not thought of before or develop new skills that they weren't getting. Uh,
yeah. I noticed this, Paul, when I work with, again, similar kids, the one thing that comes to mind is that we're a different, again, we have a different hair color, different skin color, different, everything's, that part's different. We're also very different age. So how they perceive us and how we perceive them, that there's always going to be that. And until they see you more often, then they trust that you're going to come around more often. Then over time you can build that trust, and then the who know, like, and trust kicks in. But it's one of my a quote I often refer to. It's about the world moving so fast. Um, it needs wisdom more than ever. So, Mark, I'm going to ask you to read that. I put that on the in the chats about what wisdom means and how that, now that you reflect back, and how that applies to what you learned from Paul, and then I'd like Paul's comments on it as well, because I think there's a lot to say for that, right? And we're only going to be here for so long, so why not leave something behind and plant these seeds in this younger generation? But give us the Google definition of wisdom, if you could, Mark.
Yeah, wisdom is the ability to use knowledge, experience, and good judgment to navigate life's complexities. It's often associated with insight, discernment, and ethics in decision making.
Yeah. What do you think, Paul? Does that is that information you can convey to these young kids, or these young men at this stage in their life, that you can have an impact on them?
yeah, I think so. I see wisdom as what Mark defined, but just experience,
Mm-hmm.
life experience,
Mm-hmm.
and travel
Yeah.
and seeing the world,
Yeah.
as well as you know just overall experience in business or personal or travel or whatever. You know,
Mhm.
hey, I've been there, I've done this, I succeeded at this, I failed at that,
Mhm.
and I see where you're going, and it's not going to end up very pretty. So it's easy to uh, you know, have some wisdom if you've had a lot of life experiences and you know, you haven't sat there for 70 years and just let life pass you by. So I think it's
Yeah.
very important to, be aware that everything's temporary. We're all going to, move on.
Yeah.
You really don't own anything. And, it's very fragile and just make the most of it and gain as much experience as humanly possible. I remember
Yeah.
growing up, my mother drumming into my head that one thing you don't want to do is be in your rocking chair
Mhm.
at 80 years old and have regrets that you didn't
Oh,
do something.
that's great wisdom. That's
And
yeah.
I was taught that from like the age of 7,
Wow.
right? And it was drummed into my head, and I don't know, it got in there and it never left.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I looked at life.
Mhm.
Uh, and,
Mhm.
and certainly there were mistakes or bad decisions, but I sit here today at 70 and I can honestly say I don't have any regrets. And
Yeah,
I
that's
can't
fantastic.
too
Yeah.
much, too many things I haven't done yet.
Mm.
There's a few out there, but I'm still searching.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, Paul. Two things that you said, and then first of all, like you said, wisdom is one thing, but if you don't have some life experiences to apply to that, or you haven't traveled and you haven't seen things, and you don't have a little gratitude with that wisdom, it's not as valuable. So I certainly value that perspective. But before we wrap up here, Mark, Paul's one of our a listener, not just a guest, right? And I put a remark that he put into LinkedIn, and if you could share that with this, because it certainly inspired me to want to continue to do this show every week, and it also says a lot about Paul. But if you could read that, that would be
Yeah. Well, I think it piqued your interest on knowing a little bit more about who this Paul guy was too. I think that
absolutely.
was for sure. And then I want to add something after I'm done reading it. So let me read what you're
Yeah,
referring
and
to.
just one last comment. Also appreciate you sharing your 70th, because my 60th is coming up in just a few weeks, and I'm telling you, I'm a little, I'll be a little bit transparent. It's I'm looking at that 70 and going, okay, what am I going to get excited about? And so I'm inspired by you, Paul. When I see, and I just so much appreciate your quote about not living life in regret, right? Empty the tank, leave whatever you have behind. It doesn't do us any good taking it with us. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's kind. So this is Paul took it upon himself after riding with his son to some squash tournaments in the car, listening to the Imperfect Men's Club, which apparently his son very much enjoyed as well, which is kind of
The
cool.
15-year-old son.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's cool. Yeah.
and in a world increasingly defined by division, the Imperfect Men's Club emerges as a beacon of hope and reasoned conversation. This podcast deftly navigates the complexities of civil discourse, tackling topics such as political debate in a civil manner. The Imperfect Men's Club stands out not just for its content, but for its commitment to teaching the art of conversation itself. This podcast provides a refreshing reminder that meaningful exchange is not only possible, but essential. Whether you're a seasoned debater or someone simply looking to navigate difficult conversations with grace, the podcast is a must listen. Yeah, very kind, Paul. And one of the things that I didn't want to forget, and it's been bubbling up as I listen to you guys talk, is, what was the thing that Paul helped me maybe most with? And there were quite a few. And I don't recall, how much of this was in me potentially, or that he drew out, or what the formula was, the concoction was. But this idea of paying attention. I've heard Paul say on more than one occasion in this conversation, we were in the catbird seat. This is what was happening in that particular moment. And I think, in my experience, most people have an easy time reflecting back on what was, and reflecting back on, oh, yeah, I remember that's what that was. Well, that's one thing, but recognizing it when you're actually in it, I think that's a gift. And that gift of being able to be aware, to be paying attention. And I remember that in the context of the day that I met Paul in his office, which he referred to earlier. And I knew immediately, I I need to spend more time with this guy. This guy is fucking smart. He knows what he's doing, and he seems to have recognized that I've got some potential. And that didn't slowly emerge during the course of our conversation. That hit me like a brick in the face right away, because I was paying attention. I was ready to hear what he had to say. And he always impressed me, Paul. You always impressed me as someone who was kind of always ready to understand what was going on in the moment. So, for what it's worth.
No, great stuff. So he had a charisma about him, or he had an energy about him, that you obviously said, I'm buying in on this guy, right?
Well, it was both, but there was a humility about it as well. There was a 2 feet on the ground about it. It was not, he didn't consider himself special or anything. It was just like, no, this is
Oh,
simple.
interesting.
Let's just do this, do this, do this, do this, and we'll get here. This is where we're going. The simplicity was astounding.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, that's very cool. So I'm gonna wrap up with this. We obviously, the Imperfect Men's Club, the imperfection is the perfection. So a lot of imperfection today, but clearly this is going to fall in worldview, right? As much as we thought it was business, it's worldview, and we within our worldview we talk about the importance of our childhood, and I think that's what I hear Paul tying back his childhood, how he has obviously gratitude for it, but how if he can give that back maybe to his own community, he can have an impact on these kids. But you mentioned, we talk about the wheel. It's the center is self-awareness. So I'm going to throw these out, Paul, and you just give me a response when you're done. But the ones I come up with is in self-awareness, self-control, self-forgiveness, self-respect, self-compassion, self-discipline, self-evaluation, self-assessment, and self-interest. I can keep going, but what's your comments, Paul?
I think they're all relative, but I teach my two boys self-respect.
Nice.
Respect yourself, love yourself, and don't listen to anybody else.
Mm,
You know, as long as you love yourself and respect yourself, you'll be fine.
mm. Great wisdom.
And, I think that a lot of times you run into situations and other people that will have a tendency to try to erode that.
Mm,
And as long as you stay with that, you'll be fine. Because, life, everything is temporary, and you go through life and I think to some extent, you make choices and you go in different directions, but as long as you keep your self-respect and love yourself, everything else will come to you.
wow, that's great stuff. Yeah,
Uh,
often refer to life as a confidence game, right? He
yeah.
or she who holds on to any by the time the world is trying to take it out of you prevails. But yeah, a lot of wisdom in what you said. Confidence is everything, and everybody's trying to not everybody. I don't think that's a general statement, but if you can't manage your confidence and that goes too low, it's going to be hard to be the best version of yourself. So
Yeah, I think, over time you get to realize that any person that's kind of trying to test that you got to understand where they're coming from too. And,
Mhm,
things that they've gone through and uh,
mhm.
why they're trying to do that. And
Yes,
so
that's
it's best just not to listen and to,
Mhm.
stay within yourself and look at life through your own eyes.
yeah. That was number one, self-awareness. Yeah, be self-aware that other people have different experiences and backgrounds, and that's probably one thing that I think women particularly criticize men for is not being self-aware. So it's a great way to wrap it up. But Mark, I'll let you have the final words on this one. But Paul, thank you so much, and I wish you all the best and
Well,
so much value what you're doing.
no,
Yeah,
it's
no, yeah.
great to be here and great to finally meet you, Jim, and great to see Mark again. Uh, just let me know anytime you want to come over and take a look at the kitchen. And, my wife's always interested in remodeling. So
Well,
I like,
that's
I
very
like,
timely. In fact, I'm trying to
I
do a
like
talk.
the
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
cabinets behind you. And anytime you're in Boston, you're welcome to come over.
I could definitely help you. I definitely can share my wisdom with you about your kitchen and
There you
cabinetry.
go.
I've
There you go.
sold
No,
over half
no,
a
I,
billion
I
dollars worth of
just,
cabinets. So
I just wanted to say thanks, Paul. It was really nice of you to show up. It's been great reconnecting, and this feels like maybe one of quite a few discussions to come, I hope.
yeah,
Great,
absolutely.
great, great to
Thanks,
see you.
guys.